The desert was endless, stretching beneath the burning sun like a sea of gold. In every direction the dunes rolled like waves, silent except for the whisper of wind that carried fine grains of sand. Across the land, for thousands of years, this desert had hidden secrets that men only dreamed about. Some secrets were temples buried beneath the earth. Some were kings whose names had been forgotten. And among these, one legend was older and darker than most. It was the story of a pharaoh who had been erased from history. His name had been chiseled away from walls, his statues broken, and his tomb buried far from the Valley of the Kings. The people believed he had done something so terrible that not even the gods wished to remember him. In the crowded streets of Cairo, this legend was told in whispers. Merchants spoke of it at night when lamps burned low. Guides warned curious travelers not to ask too many questions. And yet, as with every forbidden tale, the story only grew stronger with each telling. Foreigners who came to Egypt for treasure and glory were especially drawn to it. They believed that a tomb erased from memory would hold treasures greater than all the rest. Among those foreigners was a young archaeologist named Thomas. He had arrived in Cairo with little money but endless ambition. His clothes were worn from travel, his boots covered in dust, but his eyes shone with hunger for discovery. He had heard of Tutankhamun and the treasures uncovered in his resting place. He dreamed of making a find that would make the world remember his name. But what drew him most was not fame or wealth. It was the desire to solve mysteries no one else dared to touch. In a shaded cafe one evening, Thomas listened to the whispers of two old men. They spoke of a tomb hidden beyond the Nile, a tomb cursed by its own people. One man said the sandstorms themselves had been sent to cover it forever. The other man warned that anyone who tried to find it would never return. Thomas leaned closer, taking in every word. He felt his heart beat faster. This was not just a story, it was a challenge, and he could not resist it. The next day, Thomas went to the museum in Cairo, where fragments of papyrus and broken statues were kept. He studied them for hours, tracing the shapes of forgotten hieroglyphs with his finger. In one corner of a cracked tablet, he noticed a strange mark. It was the faint outline of a royal name that had been scratched away. The more he looked, the more he felt that this erased name was linked to the whispers of the lost pharaoh. He copied the markings into his notebook, determined to follow the trail. But Thomas knew he could not go into the desert alone. He needed a guide, someone who understood the land and its dangers. That was how he met Omar. Omar was a tall Egyptian man with dark eyes that seemed to see farther than the horizon. He had led many travelers across the sands, but when Thomas spoke of the forgotten tomb, Omar grew silent. At last, Omar said quietly, "Some places are buried for a reason. The desert is not empty, it remembers." Thomas smiled at the warning, thinking it was only superstition. He offered Omar good money, more than most travelers paid. At first Omar refused, but after a long pause, he agreed. He said he would guide Thomas, but he would not step inside the tomb if they found it. His duty was only to keep Thomas alive in the desert. Together they began to prepare. They gathered camels, food, water, and workers willing to dig. The workers were poor men who needed coin, but when they learned what tomb Thomas wished to find, some left at once. The few who stayed did so reluctantly, muttering prayers as they packed supplies. Even before the journey began, fear hung over them like a shadow. On the morning of departure, the sun rose red over Cairo. The small caravan crossed the Nile and headed into the desert. The first days were filled with heat and silence. Sand stretched endlessly, and the men grew tired beneath the weight of the sun. At night, the desert was cold, and the stars shone like sharp diamonds. It was during these nights that the workers whispered among themselves. They said the winds carried voices. They said the pharaoh whose name had been erased was still waiting in his tomb, angry and restless. Thomas dismissed their talk, but even he felt uneasy when he heard the wind. It did not sound like an ordinary breeze. Sometimes it seemed to carry words, faint and broken, as if someone far away was calling. Omar noticed Thomas listening and said, "This is what I warn you. The desert speaks when men go where they should not." But Thomas shook his head. "It is only air moving through the dunes," he said, though his voice was less certain than before. On the seventh day, when their supplies were growing thin, the caravan came upon a place where the sand was strangely dark. There, half buried, beneath the dunes, lay a stone slab. Its surface was worn smooth by time, but in the right light, faint carvings could be seen. Thomas knelt down, brushing away sand with his hands. His breath caught as he traced the lines. The markings matched the erased name he had copied from the museum tablet. His heart raced with excitement. He turned to Omar, his voice filled with triumph. "This is it. We have found the place." But Omar's face was heavy with fear. He stared at the stone as if it were wound in the earth. "Do not touch it," Omar said firmly. "This is the mark of the cursed one. If we uncover it, nothing good will come." The workers murmured in agreement, some stepping back from the slab. Yet Thomas stood tall, his eyes shining with determination. For him, the discovery was everything he had dreamed of. He felt he was standing at the edge of greatness. He believed the desert had hidden this secret for him to reveal. As the sun sank behind the dunes and the shadows grew long, Thomas ordered the workers to prepare their tools. Despite their fear, they obeyed, for they needed his payment. Omar turned away, staring into the desert sky as if searching for guidance. The night wind rose again, carrying whispers through the camp. No one slept well. All knew that the next day, the sands would give up what they had guarded for centuries. And so the legend of the lost Pharaoh, spoken in hushed voices for thousands of years, was about to step out of shadow and into the hands of men once more. The morning after they discovered the half-buried stone, Thomas could not stay still. He walked back and forth across the campsite, his notebook in hand, sketching the markings again and again. For him, this was the moment he had been waiting. For every explorer dreamed of stumbling upon something lost to the world. And here it was lying under the desert itself. The workers, however, were uneasy. They gathered near the camels, whispering in low voices, their eyes fixed on the strange stone. One man swore that he had heard knocking beneath the ground during the night, like someone trapped below trying to escape. Another said the markings were not only words but warnings. Their fear grew heavier with every word. Omar stood silently, watching both Thomas and the workers. He had guided travelers across deserts many times, but never had he seen a discovery that made the men so restless. He could feel the air around the stone. It was not like the air of the desert, hot and dry. It felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Finally, Omar spoke. "We should leave this place," he said in a calm voice. "The desert does not forgive those who disturb its secrets. What you are chasing is not treasure but danger." Thomas looked up from his notebook, his face glowing with determination. "Danger or not, we cannot turn back now. Do you not see what this means, Omar? This could be the greatest discovery of the century, a forgotten pharaoh, erased from history, his tomb hidden from the world. We must find it." Omar shook his head. "You speak of discovery, but discovery without wisdom is destruction. If his name was erased, it was for a reason." Thomas smiled faintly. "And that reason is exactly what I must learn. History belongs to those who write it, Omar, and I intend to write it with truth." Reluctantly, Omar ordered the workers to begin clearing the sand round the stone. The men worked slowly, their hands trembling as they moved the earth. Every strike of their tools echoed strangely in the still desert air, as though the ground itself were hollowed out. By midday, more of the slab was revealed. It was larger than anyone expected, its edges decorated with carved shapes of serpents and jackals. In the center, the scratched-out hieroglyphs were surrounded by faint images of men kneeling before a figure, whose face had been chiseled away. Thomas leaned over the carvings, his fingers brushing the lines. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the same figure from the museum tablet." His excitement grew as he imagined what lay beneath. Golden chests, jeweled masks, scrolls untouched for thousands of years. But Omar's expression darkened. He pointed at a series of smaller carvings near the edge. "Look here," he said. The carvings showed men carrying torches, their bodies twisted as if in pain. Above them was a line of symbols. Omar read them slowly, his voice low. "He who Breaks the seal, frees the darkness. The workers froze at his words. Some dropped their tools and stepped back. One man shouted that he would not go further, that his family needed him alive, not cursed. Despite Thomas's promises of payment, several men mounted their camels and rode away. Disappearing into the dunes, only a handful remained, their loyalty tied to hunger more than courage. That night, the wind rose again, stronger than before. The tents shook, ropes pulling loose. Sin whipped through the camp, stinging eyes and skin. The workers huddled together, fearful of both the storm and the stone. In the distance, faint lights flickered across the dunes, as though torches were moving without bearers. Thomas tried to convince himself it was only a trick of the wind, but deep inside, he felt uneasy. Omar sat beside the fire, staring into the flames. "I told you the desert remembers," he said softly. "Every grain of sand is a witness. You may not believe in curses, Thomas, but you must believe in balance. Something was buried here, not only to hide it, but to keep it from walking among men again." Thomas did not answer. His hands tightened around his notebook, where he had drawn the erased name. He had always believed knowledge was meant to be uncovered, that nothing should remain hidden forever. He could not let fear or superstition stop him now. The next morning, the expedition continued. They followed the markings on the slab, which pointed toward a line of low hills in the distance. Omar led them carefully, watching the sky as if expecting another storm. The heat pressed down upon them, and the men moved slowly, their water skins growing lighter with each step. As they climbed the first hill, Thomas noticed something half buried in the sand. It was a fragment of stone shaped like a pillar. He cleared it with his hands and saw carvings upon it, symbols of the sun and the underworld. Excited, he called the others. The workers unearthed more fragments, broken statues of jackal-headed guards, shattered pieces of walls, and shards of pottery painted with strange figures. It was clear they had reached the outskirts of something much larger. Beneath the hills, the desert was hiding an entire complex. Thomas's eyes shone with wonder. "Do you see, Omar? This is no myth. This is real. We are standing on history itself." Omar looked around at the broken statues, their faces struck off by chisels long ago. He touched one with his hand and felt the cold stone beneath the burning sun. "Yes," he said slowly, "but not all history wishes to be remembered. Some is buried because it brings ruin." That evening, the workers dug at the base of the hill. Their shovels struck something hard. When the sand was brushed away, they uncovered a massive block of stone fitted into the ground. Around its edges were carvings of flames and serpents. Twisted together, it was not a natural rock but a sealed doorway. Thomas knelt before it, his heart pounding. This was no ordinary tomb entrance. It was something greater, hidden deliberately and guarded with warnings. He pressed his palm against the cold surface, feeling the weight of centuries between him and what lay beyond. The workers stepped back, refusing to touch it. Omar stared at the doorway for a long time, then turned to Thomas. "You have found what you came for. Now you must decide if you will be wise enough to leave it as it is." But Thomas's eyes burned with ambition. For him, there was no choice. The doorway was not only a barrier, it was an invitation. As the stars rose above the desert, Thomas wrote in his notebook, "We are on the edge of discovery. Tomorrow, the sands will give up the tomb of the forgotten king." The workers prayed. Omar sat silently, his gaze fixed on the hills as though he expected them to move. And in the stillness of the night, the desert wind carried a sound like distant footsteps, faint but steady, echoing beneath the ground. The sun was barely rising when Thomas gathered the workers at the sealed stone doorway. The air was cool, but it carried a weight that pressed on everyone's chest. The workers stood in silence, tools hanging loosely in their hands. None of them wanted to touch the stone, and their eyes shifted nervously from Thomas to Omar. Thomas's face was full of determination. His notebook was tucked under his arm, and he spoke with excitement. "This is the entrance," he said firmly. "We must open it. Behind this door lies a forgotten world. The treasures, the scrolls, the truth of the Pharaoh who was erased. From history, all of it is waiting for us." The workers exchanged worried glances. One of them, a thin man with calloused hands, stepped forward. "Sir, this is not safe. We should not break what the ancestors sealed. There are warnings carved. Here, we can see them clearly." Thomas shook his head. "Warnings are only stories made to keep men afraid. Do you think kings of old sealed their tombs without threats to scare away robbers? This is no curse. This is only protection, and we are not thieves. We are discoverers of history." Omar placed a hand on the stone, his eyes tracing the carved serpents and flames. His voice was calm, yet heavy. "You speak as if the desert is only stone and sand. But the desert listens, Thomas. It keeps memory better than men do. When the ancestors sealed this tomb, they were not protecting treasure. They were protecting the world outside from what was inside." But Thomas did not bend. His dream had grown too strong. He ordered the workers to begin removing the sand round the doorway and then to strike the seal. After long hesitation, a few obeyed. Their hammers rang against the edges, sending echoes deep into the earth. Each strike sounded unnatural, as if it were disturbing something that had been sleeping. Hour after hour, the workers struck, chipped, and dug. By midday, the stone seal cracked. A deep groan came from within, like air escaping after centuries. The workers froze in fear. The desert fell silent round them. No wind, no bird, no sound at all. Even the camels shifted uneasily, stamping their hooves and pulling against their ropes. Thomas pushed forward, brushing his hand over the cracked doorway. His heart raced with triumph. He motioned for the workers to continue, and though their faces were pale, they obeyed. Finally, the great stone door slid aside, grinding against the earth until an opening appeared. A rush of air burst out, stale and heavy, carrying with it the smell of dust, decay, and something strange that none could name. The workers covered their faces, coughing, while Omar took a step back, his eyes dark with dread. Thomas held a torch high and peered into the opening. The light flickered against walls painted with faded colors. Hieroglyphs stretched across them, in long lines, but unlike the usual bright scenes of gods and kings, these paintings were darker. They showed battles not against men but against shadows. Figures with human bodies, but faces of smoke rose against soldiers and priests. And above them all was the image of a pharaoh, whose face had been scratched away completely. Omar spoke softly, almost to himself. They wanted his name and his image gone. Not even the memory of his face was allowed to remain. But Thomas felt only excitement. He stepped inside, his torch lighting the path. The workers hesitated at the entrance, but after Thomas shouted for them to follow, a few entered reluctantly. Omar stayed behind, standing at the doorway like a guardian unwilling to step further inside. The air was thick and dry, filled with dust that had not been disturbed for thousands of years. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the tomb itself were listening. The torchlight revealed long corridors carved deep into the rock. The walls were decorated with more scenes of war, sacrifice, and strange rituals. Unlike other tombs, where paintings showed gods guiding the dead to the afterlife, these walls showed priests binding the pharaoh with chains, their faces twisted with fear. Thomas moved quickly, his eyes wide with wonder. He stopped before one wall where an inscription caught his attention. Though parts were worn, he could make out words. He rose against the gods. He broke the covenant. He is not to be remembered. He copied the symbols into his notebook, smiling. Do you see? This is proof. This pharaoh must have been punished for rebellion. History erased him. But we have found him again. The corridor opened into a great chamber. Here the walls glittered, faintly, lined with gold leaf that still shone after centuries. In the center stood tall statues of jackal-headed guardians, their eyes set with gems that caught the torchlight and seemed to glow. Between them, treasures lay scattered golden vases, jeweled necklaces, and carved boxes stacked in rows. The workers gasped, their fear momentarily forgotten. The sight of treasure made their eyes widen. They began to whisper among themselves, their hands itching to reach out. Thomas, too, was overcome with awe. He had dreamed of this moment, and now it was real. He touched the golden mask resting on a pedestal, its surface smooth and cold. But Omar, still at the entrance, raised his voice. "Do not touch them. These things are not gifts. They are warnings left as chains to bind the past. Take nothing." The workers pulled back, uneasy again. But Thomas was lost in his ambition. He continued deeper into the chamber, past the treasure, until he reached a second doorway at the far end. Unlike the first, this one was carved from black stone, polished, until it shone like obsidian. Strange symbols surrounded it, more twisted than the ones before. Above the doorway was an image that chilled even Thomas. It showed a coffin, black as night, and from it rose a figure wrapped in red cloth, its arms stretched wide as men fled in terror. The inscription above read, "Here he sleeps. Break not the seal, or he will rise again." Thomas stared at the carving for a long moment. His torch flickered, and in the shadows it seemed almost as if the painted figure moved. But his ambition drowned out his doubt. He turned to the workers. "This is it. Beyond this lies the sarcophagus of the lost Pharaoh. We are about to see with our own eyes what no man has seen in thousands of years." The workers hesitated, fear plain on their faces. Omar's voice rang from the entrance, sharper now. "Enough, Thomas. You have come far, but you must stop here. Do not open what was meant to remain closed." But Thomas only tightened his grip on the torch. He looked back at Omar, his voice steady but filled with hunger. "History does not belong to those who are afraid. It belongs to those who dare." He stepped toward the black doorway, the workers trailing behind with lowered heads. The air grew colder, and the torchlight dimmed as if the darkness itself was pressing closer. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Waiting behind him, Omar whispered a prayer to the desert, to the sky, and to the gods who had watched long before any pharaoh ruled. He knew that once the seal was broken, nothing would be the same again. And as Thomas raised his hand to touch the cold black stone, the tomb seemed to shiver, as if it were alive. The chamber beyond the first halt was wide and deep, its walls shining faintly under the torchlight. The workers carried more torches inside, their flames trembling in the stale air. The room seemed endless, lined with painted pillars that rose high into the shadows. Each pillar showed scenes of men bowing before the erased pharaoh, their bodies drawn small and weak, while the figure of the king towered above them with weapons in his hands. Gold glittered everywhere, vases with fine engravings, necklaces strung with stones, and small statues of gods lay scattered as though placed in haste. Boxes filled with carved ivory lined the walls, and jeweled rings shone in the dust. It was a sight greater than anything Thomas had ever imagined. His eyes widened, his hands shaking with excitement as he stepped forward. "This is more than Tutankhamun," he whispered, almost in disbelief. "This is beyond anything the world has seen." The workers gasped, their fear briefly replaced with awe. One of them reached out and picked up a golden cup, its rim set with emeralds. He stared at it, the treasure shining in the torchlight, but when he placed it back down, his hand trembled. The cup left a strange mark of dust on his palm, black as ash. He rubbed it quickly against his clothes, whispering a prayer under his breath. Omar, still standing near the entrance, spoke firmly, "Do not take anything. These are not riches for the living. They were given as chains for the dead. Every piece here belongs to the tomb, not to us." Thomas looked back at him, frustration in his voice. "You call them chains, but I see history. These objects are records, proof of a forgotten time. They must be studied, shared with the world. To leave them here is to let them vanish into the sand again." Omar's gaze was steady, and to take them is to break the balance. What is buried should rest. But Thomas could not stop himself. He began examining the treasures closely, carefully lifting a jeweled mask, turning it in the light. The mask was beautiful, but unlike the masks of other kings, this one had no face. It was smooth and blank, a hollow shape of gold with empty eyes. Thomas frowned at it, strange. He murmured, "A mask with no features, as if the king was meant to have no image at all." Omar stepped forward, his voice low. "It is because he was not meant to be remembered. His face, his name, even his mask all erased." The workers grew restless. Some muttered that they should leave at once. Others whispered that the treasure was calling to them. Their eyes darted between the shining gold and the dark corners of the chamber. One man swore he saw a shadow move between the pillars, though no one was there. Another claimed the golden statues were watching him. That night, they camped inside the outer chamber, for the desert winds had grown too fierce to remain outside. The torches burned low, and the men huddled together. Their water tasted strange, carrying a sourness that made them spit it out. The bread they carried was filled with sand. Though the bags had been sealed tight, the workers grew pale and sick. Coughing as though dust filled their lungs, Thomas tried to comfort them, insisting it was only the desert air, but Omar knew better. He watched the men shiver under their blankets and whispered to Thomas, "The tomb does not want us here. It is showing its strength. Each night it will take more until you turn back." Still, Thomas refused. His ambition blinded him. He believed these were simple accidents, tricks of the desert, not signs of danger. He spent the night writing notes, sketching the strange mask, and copying more symbols from the walls. He convinced himself he was unlocking secrets that would change history. The next morning, Thomas led the workers deeper into the chamber. They discovered rows of scrolls stored in clay jars. The scrolls were older than any Thomas had ever seen. He unrolled one carefully, his hands trembling. The writing was not like the peaceful text of prayers or hymns found in other tombs. These scrolls spoke of punishment and betrayal. They told of a king who turned against his gods, who demanded worship not of the sun or sky, but of himself. They described how priests, in fear, tried to bind him with rituals and silence his name forever. Thomas's eyes shone as he read the words aloud, his voice echoing through the chamber. This is the truth. He rebelled against his own gods. That is why he was erased. This explains everything. But Omar shook his head. You think you are reading history. You are reading warnings. They are not records for the curious. They are warnings for the living, so no man would repeat what was done. The workers grew more afraid. One by one, they begged to leave. One man fell ill, his skin burning with fever though the air was cool. Another claimed he dreamed of a tall figure wrapped in red cloth, standing at the edge of his bed, whispering words he could not understand. They woke screaming in the dark, their cries echoing through the stone halls. The treasure no longer dazzled them. It seemed like bait, set to draw them deeper. Even Thomas, in quiet moments, felt a coldness creep into his heart. He would pause while writing, staring at the shadows flickering on the walls. At times, he thought he heard footsteps behind him. But when he turned, no one was there. Yet still he pressed on. He believed he was on the edge of something greater, past the treasures, past the warnings. There was another chamber waiting. The black doorway stood at the far end, silent and solid, holding within it the sarcophagus of the forgotten king. That night, Omar sat near the fire with Thomas, his voice steady but heavy with sorrow. I have seen men chase gold until their hearts turn hollow. I have seen explorers dig until the desert swallowed them whole. But you, Thomas, are chasing something worse. You are chasing a shadow that was meant to stay in the dark. Thomas looked up from his notebook, his face pale from exhaustion, but still burning with ambition. You do not understand, Omar. This is not about gold. This is about truth. If this Pharaoh was erased, it means history is not complete. My discovery will make it whole again. I cannot stop now. Omar shook his head slowly. Truth can guide or destroy. Some truths were buried so they would never rise again. The wind outside howled against the stone, as though the desert itself agreed with him. But Thomas would not listen. He was already thinking of the black doorway. The last barrier between him and the lost Pharaoh died, and while the camp tried to sleep, the torches flickered low, their light stretching across the painted walls. In the glow of the fire, the figures on the walls seemed to shift, their arms reaching, their faces bending. The workers shut their eyes tightly, but even in sleep, they could feel the tomb watching them die by morning. 2 men were gone, their beds empty, their tools left behind. No footprints marked the sand outside the entrance. It was as if the desert had swallowed them whole. Thomas stood at the center of the chamber, staring at the black doorway. His face was pale, but his eyes shone with fierce resolve. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "we open it." The black doorway stood before them like a silent guardian. Its polished surface shone faintly under the torchlight, reflecting the flames in strange patterns. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though the tomb itself was warning them to turn back. For hours Thomas studied the strange carvings that covered the stone frame. The symbols were sharper here, deeper, and darker. They spoke of chains, fire, and endless sleep. Above, the figure of a coffin with a body rising out of it seemed almost alive in the flickering light. The workers refused to go near it. They huddled at the far end of the chamber, whispering prayers. Some of them swore they had seen movement in the shadows, long shapes slipping between the pillars, never touching the light. Others claimed they heard faint breathing in the dark corridor behind them. Though no one stood there, Omar's eyes never left the black doorway. His face was hard, his jaw tight. He spoke quietly, as if afraid his words might wake something. "This is the heart of the tomb. What lies beyond was sealed for eternity. Thomas, I beg you, leave it closed." But Thomas's ambition was stronger than his fear. He turned to Omar, his voice steady but filled with hunger. "Do you not see? This is the greatest discovery of our time. The world must know who this Pharaoh was. To stop now would be to throw away everything we have found." Omar shook his head. "You are not listening. This is not a discovery. This is a warning carved in stone. The ancients did not erase his name for greed or jealousy. They erased him because he brought ruin. And if you open that door, you may bring ruin as well." Thomas's eyes burned with determination. History cannot be buried forever. It is our duty to reveal it. That night the camp was restless. The men could not sleep. The torches flickered low, their flames thin and weak. Strange sounds echoed through the chamber, footsteps that never reached their ears, whispers in a language no one understood. The workers clutched their blankets, refusing to close their eyes. Thomas sat awake, writing in his notebook, though his hand trembled more than before. He told himself it was only exhaustion, but deep inside he felt a chill he could not explain. Twice he thought he saw a shadow moving across the far wall, though no torch was near it. When he turned quickly, there was nothing. Omar kept watch near the entrance, his spear across his lap. He did not write or speak. He only listened to the tomb, as if trying to understand what it wanted. At one point, he looked at Thomas and said in a low voice, "The desert is patient. It has waited for centuries to keep this sealed. Do not think it will forgive us for breaking it." By morning, one of the workers was gone. His bed was empty, his tools left where he had placed them the night before. No footprints led outside. The men searched, but the desert sand was untouched. It was as though the man had been taken into the walls themselves. Fear spread through the camp. The remaining workers refused to stay another day. They shouted that the tomb was alive, that the shadows were taking men one by one. Thomas tried to calm them, promising more gold if they remained, but most mounted their camels and fled. Only two workers stayed, too poor to leave even with fear burning in their eyes. Omar turned to Thomas. "The desert has spoken. Even your men will not stay. We must leave now, before it takes all of us." But Thomas stood tall, his face pale yet determined. "If you wish to leave, then leave. I will not abandon this discovery. If I must open the doorway myself, I will." The two remaining workers glanced at each other, then lowered their heads. Against their fear, greed kept them bound. They followed Thomas as he prepared to open the black doorway. They brought chisels and hammers, striking at the edges of the sealed stone. Each blow echoed through the chamber, deeper than it should have, as if the sound traveled into a hollow place far below. Dust rose in clouds, filling the air with a bitter taste. As they worked, the torches flickered wildly. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting into shapes that looked like men. The workers dropped their tools in fear, swearing that the shadows were moving without them. Thomas shouted at them to keep going, his own voice shaking though he tried to hide it. Finally, the seal cracked. A long groan came from the stone, followed by a rush of air so cold it snuffed out one of the torches. The chamber fell half into darkness, the firelight struggling against the heavy black. The two workers stepped back, their eyes wide with terror. Thomas pressed his hand to the stone, his breath quick. He pushed, and slowly the black doorway shifted open. Behind it lay a chamber darker than night. The torchlight could not reach its far walls. At the center stood a massive sarcophagus, carved from the same black stone, polished until it shone. Strange red cloth wrapped around it, as if to bind it tightly shut. Round the base were carvings of priests kneeling, their arms raised, their faces twisted in fear. Thomas stepped forward, his heart racing. The sarcophagus, he whispered. The Pharaoh himself. Omar did not move. His voice was low and firm. Do not open it, Thomas. You have seen the signs, the sickness of your men, the vanishings, the whispers in the dark. All of this is the tomb warning you. If you open that coffin, nothing will stop what follows. But Thomas was blinded by his dream. He raised his torch high, staring at the black coffin bound in red cloth. He could almost feel the weight of history pressing against it. He imagined his name written in books, remembered forever as the man who revealed the lost king. The two workers hesitated, torn between fear and obedience. At last, Thomas shouted at them to help him lift the heavy lid. Together they pushed, their hands straining against the stone. The sarcophagus groaned as it moved, the sound deep and unnatural, echoing through the chamber like a cry. When the lid shifted enough, a rush of cold air spilled out, sharper than ice. The torches flickered, almost dying. For a moment, silence filled the tomb. Then came a faint sound, soft but clear. Footsteps, slow, steady, and hollow. The workers froze. Their eyes darted around the chamber, but no one was moving. The footsteps seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One of the workers dropped his torch and ran for the door, his screams echoing as he vanished into the dark corridor. The other fell to his knees, whispering prayers. Thomas stood frozen, his torch trembling in his hand. He tried to convince himself it was only his imagination, only echoes. But then he felt it, a breath of air, cold and steady, moving across his face from the coffin itself. Omar gripped his spear tightly, his voice ringing out. You have done it, Thomas. You have broken the seal. Now the shadows will not rest. The chamber grew colder, the air heavy with unseen weight. The torches dimmed until the room was nearly black. And somewhere in the dark, the sound of the footsteps grew louder. The chamber was colder than the desert night. Every breath Thomas took felt like ice filling his lungs. His torch shook in his hand, the flame fighting to stay alive against the unseen draft that came from the open coffin. The sound of footsteps echoed again, slow, steady, and deliberate. The two men left in the chamber turned their heads in every direction, but no one was there. Omar's spear glinted in the faint light as he stood ready. His eyes locked on the sarcophagus. The black coffin stood open just enough to reveal darkness within. The red cloth binding it had loosened, but not broken. It hung like torn skin, fluttering slightly in the cold air. Thomas felt an invisible pull toward it, as if the coffin itself was calling his name. Omar stepped closer, his voice sharp. Do not touch it. You have already gone too far. Leave the coffin shut. Leave the tomb. Now. Thomas swallowed hard. His hands trembled, but his pride refused to let him back away. He forced his voice steady. If I leave this closed, no one will ever know who this Pharaoh was. Centuries of history will remain silent. I cannot stop now. I must finish this. The last worker, kneeling on the ground, whispered prayers as he shook with fear. He would not rise, nor would he meet Thomas's eyes. His torch had burned out, and he refused to relight it. Then the sound changed. It was no longer footsteps. It was a whisper, long and low, echoing across the chamber. The voice was deep, older than any human tongue, yet Thomas understood a single word: leave. The torchlight dimmed further, the flames nearly vanishing. Omar's grip on his spear tightened. It warns you, Thomas, even now. It offers you a chance. Close the coffin, seal the doorway, leave before it wakes. But Thomas felt trapped between fear and ambition. His heart told him to run, but his mind clung to the dream of discovery. He raised his torch higher and stepped toward the sarcophagus. This Pharaoh will not remain forgotten. As he reached out, the last worker let out a sharp cry. His eyes widened in terror, staring into the shadows behind Thomas. Before Thomas could turn, the worker dropped flat against the floor. His body stiffened, his eyes rolled back, and his chest stopped moving. Silence fell. The man lay lifeless. His prayer unfinished, Thomas's torchlight wavered. His voice broke. He just collapsed. Omar's eyes darkened. The tomb takes its price. It warned you. Now it claims the ones who disturb it. The echo of the whisper returned, louder this time, wrapping around them like smoke. The single word repeated, "Leave." Thomas backed away from the sarcophagus, his courage faltering. He looked at Omar, his eyes wide with fear for the first time since the dig began. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this place was never meant to be touched. Omar did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the coffin. The red cloth now quivered, though no wind touched it. From the open crack, a deeper blackness seemed to spill out, darker than shadow, heavier than stone. Then the footsteps returned, this time faster, circling the chamber. Thomas spun, raising his torch in every direction, but saw nothing. The sound grew until it thundered in his ears, yet no shape appeared. The flame of his torch suddenly stretched long and thin, as if pulled by invisible hands. Then it went out. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Thomas shouted in fear, but the sound of his voice seemed small, crushed by the heavy air. He tried to relight his torch, but his shaking hands dropped the flint. Sparks danced for a moment, then vanished into the black dot. Omar remained calm, though his breathing was heavy. Do not move. The shadows are watching. A faint glow appeared from the coffin. Not fire, not light, but something pale and cold. It spilled from the crack of the sarcophagus, shaping into outlines on the floor. At first they looked like smoke, then like figures, men bowing, women wailing, warriors kneeling. All of them appeared to rise from the stone, as if the past itself was bleeding into the present. Thomas's knees weakened, his voice shook. Are they spirits? Omar answered, with a voice heavy as stone. They are memories, the last cries of those who sealed this place. They are here to remind us what must remain buried. The pale figures faded, but the cold light remained, glowing faintly from the coffin. Then came a new sound, heavy and hollow, like stone grinding against stone. The lid of the sarcophagus shifted again, moving by itself. The red cloth split down the middle, the threads snapping one by one. Omar lifted his spear, planting his feet firm. Stay back, Thomas. Do not let it see your fear. But Thomas could not move. His body shook as he watched the coffin open. His heart pounded so hard it echoed in his ears. The lid slid farther, revealing the outline of a figure inside, a face hidden beneath a mask of gold, worn yet shining in the cold light. Its eyes were not empty. They glowed faintly, as if watching. From beyond death, the air turned heavier. Thomas could hardly breathe. Every part of him screamed to flee, yet he could not look away. His voice cracked as he whispered, "The Pharaoh." Omar lowered his spear slowly, his voice deep and grim. Not a pharaoh, a prisoner, one who should never rise. The golden mask tilted ever so slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. Then the whisper returned, but this time it was not a warning. It was a command, "Stay." The walls of the chamber groaned, dust falling from the ceiling. The shadows thickened, swallowing what little light remained. The open doorway they had entered through now seemed impossibly far, a black tunnel stretching forever. Thomas dropped to his knees, covering his ears. Though the whisper came from inside his mind, he cried out, "What have I done?" Omar stood, firm, his eyes never leaving the coffin. "You have broken the seal. Now you must pay the price." The golden eyes inside the coffin shone brighter. The shadows surged forward, crawling across the floor like water. They reached for Thomas, wrapping around his arms and legs. He struggled, but the more he moved, the tighter they pulled. Omar shouted, charging forward with his spear, striking at the shadows. For a moment they recoiled, the pale figures of the past flashing again. But the darkness quickly closed in. The last thing Thomas saw before the shadows swallowed him was the golden mask, staring at him with eyes that did not blink. the tomb had chosen. The desert was silent, but the silence was not peaceful. The wind no longer whistled across the dunes. The night carried no sound of jackals or owls. It was as if the sands themselves waited, holding their breath, listening for what had been. Awakened beneath them, above the buried ruins, the stars shone cold and distant. The camp that once bustled with workers and fires now lay broken. Tents were torn, ropes snapped, and the tools of discovery scattered in the sand. Only Omar stood, leaning on his spear, his face dark with sorrow. The tomb entrance behind him had sealed itself. The stone blocks that Thomas and the workers had forced open were once again closed tight, as though the desert had swallowed them whole. No mark remained of the struggle inside, except for Omar's shaking hands and the weight in his heart. He had survived, but he carried the truth. Thomas was gone, claimed by shadows that no human could fight. The last worker lay lifeless inside the chamber. Omar had fought until the darkness forced him out, until the tomb itself pushed him back into the night, when he stumbled into the desert air. The entrance sealed, trapping the whispers and the golden mask inside forever. Omar knew the tomb was not just a resting place. It was a prison, and now the prison had been disturbed. He sank to his knees in the sand, his eyes lifting toward the stars. His voice was low and steady, carrying both grief and warning. The desert does not forget. Those who touch what must remain buried will pay the price. Days passed before Omar returned to the nearest village. His steps were heavy, and his clothes were torn with dust and blood. The villagers stared as he entered, their whispers following him. They asked about Thomas, about the foreign men who had promised gold and fame. Omar gave no details. He only said, "The tomb has taken them. It will take more if you go near." Some did not believe. Curiosity burned brightly in their hearts. They pressed him for answers, demanding to know where the tomb lay. Omar refused to tell them. His silence made him an outcast, a man feared rather than trusted. Yet he carried that burden willingly, for he had seen what waited in the dark. Years turned into decades. The desert winds buried the last signs of the camp. The dunes shifted, swallowing the tomb entrance deeper and deeper, until not even Omar could find it again. The Pharaoh's prison vanished back into legend. But the story did not die. Omar spoke to travelers, to scholars, to children who asked about the dangers of the sands. His words became warnings. He told of a lost pharaoh, locked away not for honor but for fear. He told of whispers in the dark and shadows that moved like living smoke. He told of a foreign man whose pride opened what should never be touched. The story spread from one campfire to another, from one caravan to the next. It reached cities, where scribes wrote it down, changing details, adding color, turning it into myth. Some believed Omar's tale, some dismissed it as fear and superstition. Yet the warning remained, echoing across the desert like the sound of the wind. Do not seek the tomb that should never be opened. As the years passed, Omar grew old. His beard turned white, his hands shook, but his eyes still burned with the memory of the golden mask. On his last night, he sat before the fire with his grandchildren. The flames danced in their wide eyes as they listened to his final words. I have seen what lies beneath the sand. I have seen a prison built not by men, but by time itself. Remember this, children. Riches fade, fame dies, but curses live forever. Promise me you will never go searching for what the desert hides. The children nodded, though some part of them still carried curiosity. Omar closed his eyes for the last time, his spirit heavy yet at peace. For he had done all he could to keep the secret buried. But secrets have a way of surviving. Generations later, when maps were drawn and machines carved through the desert with ease, whispers of the lost pharaoh's tomb returned. Young explorers read of Omar's tale in old books. They laughed at the warnings, calling them superstition. They dreamed of treasure, of golden masks, of names carved into history. One group set out, armed not with torches and spears, but with lights and drills. They followed the scattered clues. The stories carried through time. The desert gave no answer at first, but the sands are patient. After weeks of digging, the explorers uncovered a strange layer of stone unlike any other. It was not a doorway, but the shape of one lay hidden beneath the rock. They cheered. Believing they had found greatness, cameras recorded every step, voices shouted with excitement, and hands worked quickly to break the seal. But as the stone cracked, a cold wind rose from the gap, though the desert air was still and hot. The torches flickered, the cameras dimmed, and the voices fell silent. One of the young men stepped closer, smiling as he pressed his hand against the crack. He turned to his companions and said, "This is only the beginning." Far away, in the village where Omar's story first began, an old carving still remained on the wall of a forgotten house. It showed a mask of gold with eyes that glowed. Beneath it were words scratched in haste. "Almost lost to time. The tomb must remain closed. If opened, it will rise again." The desert wind carried the message as the explorers forced the door wider. Sand swirled across the dunes, covering their tracks, erasing their names, preparing to guard the tomb once more, for in the heart of the earth, where shadows breathe and whispers wait, the golden mask still lies, watching. Its eyes remain open, patient as the centuries roll by, knowing that one day curiosity will always return. And when it does, the price will be paid again.